my pleasure to be with you today, and I will share you some of our works. Feel free to interrupt me if I am not very clear. I hope also I will be in time. 45 minutes talk, something like that. So I invite you for our work from image-guided radiation toward adaptive radiation, and also considering another aspect of those guided radiation, of MRI-based planning and so on. So in this talk there will be actually 4 parts, and the first part is the justification of IGRT and adaptive radiation. You already know the justification of IGRT. Actually, I am 52 years old, and then when I consider back all the works which have been done in the field of radiation, we spent many times, let's say, 2 or 3 decades trying to optimize the dose distribution. And this is still the case using photon and so on with our ARC IMRT. The other axis of work is the definition of the tumor as well as the organatrice. Again, there are a lot of improvements trying to optimize this definition. Leading to what we can call those tumor painting or even sculpting, which is quite very nice. And in the paper it appears feasible to, let's consider the prostate, to even increase the dose inside the prostate up to 100 gray. This is only a dosimetric study, not a clinical study, while sparing the organatrice, respecting the dose construct. This is on the paper. But what was really forgotten is that painting. You may know this painting from Magritte, and this is not a pipe. You all agree with that? This is not a pipe. This is a representation of the pipe. And this is really something we a bit forgot in the past, not considering only the planned dose, but really the delivered dose, which may not correspond due to several anatomical variations occurring during treatment. Anatomical variation occurring between fraction, during the fraction, and 2 kinds of anatomical variation can be considered: the displacements, which are relatively easy to correct, and deformations. And of course, the issue behind this anatomical variation is the risk of tumor underdose and therefore recurrence, and organatrice overdose and therefore toxicity. And actually, this is a paper I published several years ago in the Rennes journal at a time when IGRT didn't exist. And I remember when I was speaking with my colleagues, considering the fact that maybe we may need to check the position of the prostate. A lot of colleagues were skeptical, saying, "Oh, the most important is the dose distribution," and so on. So the idea, what I have done in a series of patients treated at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, I just looked at the impact of rectal distension at the time of the planning. And actually what was found is that rectal distension on the planning increased the risk of biochemical failure through an increased risk of local recurrence. Just because on that, you can see this dose distribution. It was almost 15 years ago, so it's not a nice IMRT planning. But whatever, if you have a rectal distension at the time of the planning, if you do not use any IGRT, the risk is that during the treatment, the prostate moves posteriorly, and the tumor is located inside the prostate completely posteriorly. So what was shown in this paper is a clear relationship between rectal distension and the risk of biochemical failure, local failure, and also toxicity. So it was a good, it was a quite nice demonstration of the necessity to consider the prostate position during treatment. True for the prostate, but also for other tumor localization like head and neck. Of course, there may be displacements, small displacements of the patient under the mask tumor and parotid glands shrinking also during the treatment, weight loss, so that during the treatment there may several deformations may occur, and the tumor shrinking is obvious and quite complex also. If you analyze the tumor in head and neck, in this case, this shrinking, this is quite complex shrinking, hard to modelize. And this is also true for the parotid gland. The decreasing of the volume is around 30% between before the treatment and at the end of the treatment. So the consequence of that, if you consider this dose distribution at the time of the planning, here the tumor, here the two parotid glands, the dose distributions appears quite good. But what can happen during the treatment, that due to the tumor shrinking, to the parotid glands shrinking, hotspots may occur and very close to the parotid gland. So again, what is planned is not really what is delivered. And it's true also for the cervix, with this motion of the cervix, of the uterus, depending mostly on bladder filling, but not only on bladder filling, but mostly. So again, the upper part of the uterus can move up to 6 cm, which is quite a lot. So there is a clear need to define strategies to compensate for all these anatomical variations. So historically, and there are two kind of anatomical variation: displacement and deformation. For displacement, the simplest historical way was to define PTV and PRV around our target. This is obvious today, but I remember again 20 years ago, the definition of such margin were relatively empirical. People say that the prostate should move around something like 1 cm, so the PTV can be 1 cm. But then, of course, the choice of this PTV margin has been more mathematically defined based on several measurements and based also on several receipts, like this Rennes receipt, really to define appropriate PTV margin around the target. But you must also keep in mind that even this PTV definition takes in account displacement, but not deformation. This is also a limitation of the first limitation of this approach, and this is a population-based approach, not a patient-based approach. So there is really a need there was really a need to develop personal approach like this displacement. So I will focus on prostate because this is my main clinical activity. And actually, before the time of all this IGRT device, there are several ways to try to limit the prostate motion, or even to limit the dose inside the rectal wall by all these means, from the simplest one to in the past, the rectal balloon was also used trying to fix the prostate, which was actually not a very good idea because it was relatively painful. And the other thing is, by pushing anteriorly the prostate, for some patients the seminal vesicles remain posteriorly around the rectum, and finally the rectum was not too much spared, and more recently the use of hyaluronic acid and so on. This is one way. Of course, the other way is to use IGRT. For prostate, this is mostly the use of CBCT, of physicians. And looking at the literature, looking at the question of is there a real benefit of using IGRT in prostate radiation? The answer is yes, based on several studies, but without any randomized study. There are several papers comparing IGRT, a treatment without IGRT with a treatment with IGRT. Several of them are retrospective, again, no randomized studies. And what all these studies show is that IGRT in prostate truly decreases the risk of both acute and late urinary and digestive toxicity. So that's why IGRT has become a standard combined with IMRT in prostate cancer remediation. The most important study maybe is from the Memorial, treating a very high dose inside the prostate, more than 86 gray, but to be honest, this is only a subpart of the prostate. This is not the full prostate. But Zalewski demonstrates that IGRT, the use of IGRT decreased strongly both the risk of GU and GI toxicity. And I had just this study published in the Red Journal, presented last year at the ASCO GU meeting in San Francisco. This was another question. When I designed this study, it was something like 8 years ago. I wanted at the beginning to show really the benefit of IGRT by comparing treatment with or without IGRT. But at this time, even today, it was not really ethical, acceptable to say to a patient, we know that your prostate moves, and we just randomized between without use of any IGRT and the use of IGRT to check that really, to demonstrate that there was a benefit of IGRT. So in this trial, I just wanted to test if we had really to use IGRT daily to correct for both systematic and random error, or only day 1, day 3, day 1, day 2, day 3, and weekly control to correct for systematic error only. The systematic error is based on a strong difference between the planning and what happens during the treatment. This is the slide I showed you before in the rectal, with the distended rectum. It means that if the rectum is very distended at the time of the planning and less distended during the treatment, you will have a systematic error. And this systematic error can be detected relatively easily and corrected easily without checking at each fraction, if there is systematic error only. So the goal of this trial was really to compare two frequencies of IGRT in a series of more than 450 patients. This is the patient we used in our work together. And the hypothesis was to decrease the risk of biochemical failure by doing a daily control. And the follow-up was relatively short. And looking at the results of this study, the good news is that by doing a daily control versus a weekly control, the risk of rectal toxicity was significantly decreased by 1/3. So it means that without any use of toxicity, maybe the risk of toxicity may be even more. And the risk of biochemical recurrence was also decreased by using a daily control versus a weekly control, demonstrating again the necessity of a daily IGRT when treated prostate cancer. But this is the good news. But the bad news, the good news also is that not only PSA failure was decreased, but also the risk of clinical recurrence. Clinical recurrence means recurrence somewhere, either in the prostate, in the lymph nodes, or in the both. And again, the risk of clinical recurrence, this is what matters for the patient. PSA is only biology, but for the patient what really matters is, of course, clinical recurrence. And the risk of clinical recurrence was decreased by 50% by using a daily control versus a weekly control, a weekly IGRT. This was the good news of the results, but there was also the bad news, and I let open the discussion. Very surprisingly, the overall survival was significantly decreased. The p-value is here by a factor of 2 by using a daily control. By using a daily control, you decrease toxicity, you decrease biochemical failure and clinical failure, but you decrease also overall survival related to what? I looked also at the second cancer incidence. Second cancer means doesn't mean radio-induced cancer. It means apparition of appearance of other cancer somewhere. And the second cancer incidence was multiplied by 2 by using a daily control. And at the same time, the tumor localization was mostly outside the pelvis at more than 80%, and they appear relatively early, 31 months, not suggesting that they are radio-induced cancer. But anyway, it was strange, and it was something very, very hard for me to explain and to see that by doing daily IGRT, survival was slightly decreased, and also related to the apparition of other cancer, mostly again outside the pelvis. These were the results. So, this was the case of prostate. And for prostate, the biggest issue, of course, is the displacement. But for most of the organs, the biggest issue is not only displacement, but deformations. So, to go to this issue of adaptive radiation, which means several planning, and we see that several planning can mean several planning before the treatment, like planning library, or during treatment, like replanning. An interesting point, an important point, I think, is really to be able to monitor the dose during treatment. Because there is something else which is strange in our world, is that currently when we report what we have done, we report the planned dose. And we should really, even as a reporting, report what we have delivered, not what we have planned to deliver. This is like for a surgeon saying that I plan to remove whatever, which is quite different that I have removed. And we should go to really to this issue of dose reporting. And this dose reporting is a key also to decide or not to replan, I think. Not to replan automatically, but based on dose monitoring, deciding to or not to replan. So what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that first, there is a need to estimate the dose at the fraction. And to estimate the dose at the fraction in control, of course. And for that, the first step, and which is an open issue also, is to be able to quickly delineate, let's say on CBCT, the organ of interest. And there are also several works doing that, more recently using deep learning method, whatever. But I think in the next future we should be able, day after day, to delineate the contour on the onboard imaging, and then to estimate the dose at the fraction, or to calculate the dose at the fraction. So there are several ways to do that. The first one is just to import the dose from the planning to the daily imaging. And actually, in case of prostate, there is no much, there are anatomical deformation inside the pelvis, it's true. But the contour of the patient doesn't change too much. So we published work in the Red Journal showing that except for the rectum in case of rectal gas appearance, it appears quite acceptable to consider the dose from the planning to the online imaging. I don't know if I'm clear. Of course, for other tumor localization like head and neck, you have so huge deformation, so huge shrinking that you need to recalculate the dose. And for that, this is also another issue, open issue, to be able to calculate the dose on the CBCT. And there are several works on that I will not develop. And the third approach is not really to calculate the dose on the online imaging, but to measure the dose on the online imaging. These are three different ways to estimate or to calculate the dose at the fraction. So it's nice, but it means that in practice you may have after each fraction a DVH, which is quite not easy to manage. So you need absolutely to be able to cumulate the dose, to monitor the dose, and to compare this cumulated dose to the planned dose, and deciding or not to replan. So, how to cumulate the dose? And in this example, first, again in the case of prostate, the idea I know that you already know that. It means that you have your CBCT with the anatomy of the CBCT, your planning CT, and then the goal is to report the dose, to propagate the dose of the daily imaging to the planning CT. So how to do that is the way to do that is to consider the elastic transformation of the anatomy and to apply this transformation to the dose at each fraction, then being able to accumulate the dose of each fraction on the anatomy of the planning CT, on which, of course, which is your reference. And then to compare the accumulated dose to the planning dose, and then to decide or not to do something. This is, in this example, what was done for the bladder. Here is the reference volume of the bladder, which was like that. And then at the fraction, because the bladder volume was lower, at the fraction the dose received by the bladder was higher. And then by using elastic registration, it appears possible to accumulate the dose, fraction after fraction. And it's a kind of dose monitoring. Oops. Doesn't work well. Oh, yeah, sorry, like that. And then being able to really to realize that the accumulated dose may be really different than the planned dose. So it's possible also to have a 3D approach, and then in a 3D way to subtract the cumulative dose to the planned dose, and then realize that there are some hotspots which are in red there, in the bladder and the rectum, or fortunately cold spots in the organatrix. For the prostate, the dose is the same. Why? Because IGRT was used, so the dose in the prostate was quite the same. But here, due to the deformation of the structures, you can see that close to the, depending on the structure, the dose was not the same. Is it clear or not? I'm not sure. So we have just this paper published we had this paper published in the British Journal, just looking at a series of patients treated by IMRT and IGRT to a total dose of 78 gray, and you can see that the dose difference was the mean dose, considering the mean dose in the bladder, in average the mean difference between the planned dose and the cumulative dose was 7.5 gray and up to 20 gray. It's a huge difference. It means that really your planned dose for the bladder may not represent what happens during treatment. And coming back to the issue of predicting toxicity, it opens what does it mean to work on all these planned dose if such things appear. 20 gray difference between the planned and the delivered dose is not 0 point something gray. It's a lot. We did the same thing for the rectum. Again, 2.4 gray for the mean dose and for every endpoint of the DVH. By subtracting the DVH, the planned DVH to the cumulative DVH, there are, in this series of patients, there are really differences. And for the parotid gland, this is the same story. We use also an elastic registration approach to accumulate the dose in the parotid gland, which is quite, which can be discussed, because as I will say after, elastic registration is acceptable when you have a deformable structure like rectum and bladder. But when you have tissue disappearance, like for the tumor or for the parotid, it may be not really correct to consider the elastic cumulative approach. So anyway, here, in this case, we had weekly CT. Here is the planned dose in the parotid gland, and considering the dose received weekly. Here, it means that at the 5th week, the planned dose was more than the accumulated dose was superior than the planned dose. And again, analyzing the results in a 3D approach, this part of the parotid gland received more than 10 gray than what was really planned, just due to the anatomical deformation.
So I don't treat kidney, but the parotid shrinks normally during radiotherapy, does it? Because question.
Yeah.
Does the parotid normally shrink during radiotherapy because of the apoptosis, or?
It's a good question. Actually, there is at the beginning there is really an inflammation reaction, and the parotid gland may even increase a little, and then decrease. I don't know exactly.
Is it normal for parotids to decrease during kidney treatment?
It's normally decrease, yes. Yeah. In average, it's decrease of 30%, depending on the patient. It can be more or less, but really this is and this hotspot is not only due to the parotid gland shrinking. This is also due to the tumor shrinking and weight loss and so on. So in this series of only 15 patients, but they had a weekly CT, we were able to quantify here is each patient, the ipsilateral and the contralateral parotid gland, to show that some patients really the parotid gland are really overdosed. And some of the patients, some of the parotid gland are also, and this is good news for the patient, underdosed, which is quite complex. And by looking, by considering this dose difference, it was possible to estimate the risk of xerostomia just due to this parotid gland overdose, which is quite which may be clinically significant. So it means that again, here you may have in a series of patients what you have planned to deliver, and here is the DVH, what you have really delivered, which represents, in average, almost 4 gray of parotid gland overdose. And we were surprised because it's relatively true also for the CTV coverage. Here in blue is the planned dose, and by considering what was really delivered, some of the patients had very surprisingly CTV underdose. If I say that, surprisingly, is that because intuitively, if the parotid gland shrink, if the tumor shrink, you may think that for a structure which is shrinking inside the PTV, you may not have any underdose. I mean, but actually for some patients, you may have. So, after doing that, you need really to consider the limitation of this process, and this is mostly based on physics consideration. Because, to be honest, the use of deformable image registration in routine treatment, I don't know if you agree with that, but is relatively obvious for contour propagation. You will win time. It can be visually checked and corrected. For to accumulate the dose, as I showed before, there is a really need for validation, because there are several issues behind the use of elastic registration to accumulate the dose. The first one is really to consider the accuracy of your elastic registration algorithm. Depending on the algorithm, the accuracy may be different. You cannot use elastic registration to accumulate the dose in case of tissue disappearance. And also, what we have done in all these studies is consider, let's say, a dose inside the Vogt cell, a grade. And actually, this is not exactly true. This is an energy deposit per mass unit. And you may really use a Monte Carlo calculation and a more accurate approach from a physics point of view than just propagate the dose like we have done. And there are work also work on that. So to estimate the accuracy of the elastic registration, the simplest way is to consider the dye score. There are other scores like the Jacquard score and so on. And you can also consider reference points. And looking at what happens, you have a reference point. You use your registration method, and you can quantify the distance of your registration point and your actually true points in the propagate in the target image. And this is also work we have done just in head and neck, looking at several elastic registration or rigid methods, considering several landmarks and showing that the accuracy of the registration methods are maybe very different. Another way we use to estimate the accuracy of the elastic registration is to generate a numerical phantom. The idea behind that is to generate a numerical phantom in which you know the deformation based on this is a mechanical deformation, and then you can compare the localization of the point by using your elastic registration method compared to the ground truth mechanical deformation. This is a way to do that, and therefore to consider the accuracy of the dose propagation by using an elastic registration method. I don't know if I am clear or not. And by doing that, we have done that in a series of patients. The idea was to estimate the accuracy of the elastic registration method when estimating the difference of dose between the planned dose and the accumulated dose, just to have an idea of this accuracy. And actually, it was quite the inaccuracy of the elastic registration was quite a lot smaller than the impact of the anatomical variation on the dose. I don't know if I am clear or not. Anyway, so we know that there are anatomical deformation. We know that there is an impact on the dose. So we need to do something in case of deformation, which is truly the field of adaptive reduction. So in head and neck, what can be done? This is really replanning. Replanning, let's come back to our patients. There is a hotspot here. The idea is not to do one planning before treatment, but to replan during treatment so that, in particular, the parotid glands are spared during treatment like they were spared at the time of the planning. This is simple. And by doing that, if you look at the difference between no replanning and replanning, you will be able to strongly decrease the dose in the parotid gland to correct the parotid gland overdose. This is in theory. And again, in this series of patients, due to anatomical deformation, there was a parotid gland overdose without doing anything. But by doing, in this case, a weekly replanning, it was possible to really decrease the dose in the parotid gland. This is theory, and actually, and to do also replanning also allows to correct for the CTV underdose. This was a dosimetric approach, but we just completed a randomized trial comparing a standard approach, one planning, versus a weekly replanning, trying to demonstrate that by using a weekly replanning, we were able to decrease, of course, the dose, the parotid gland overdose, and also to decrease the risk of xerostomia. And this randomized trial has been ended. The IGRT has been ended a few months ago, and I am in charge of this trial. We do the analysis, just really to demonstrate the interest of a weekly replan. But another issue behind that is, as I showed you before, it's nice to discover, to realize that your fraction after fraction, you have the delivered dose is superior to the planned dose, but what to do really? How many times to replan, when to replan, this is another issue. And in this work, published in the Greek journal, what we have tried, and actually it was a Chinese colleague who has done the work, you will understand why. This is here you have the level of the dose at the time of the planning, without any replanning. In average, the parotid gland were overdose of 1.1 gray, and what we try to look at is the impact of one replanning, either at week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, trying to look at the impact of 2 replanning, week 1 and 2, week 1 and 3, and so on, 3 replanning, all the combination. And then, by doing that, this is the impact of 1 replanning only, because the question is, do we need really to replan weekly, which is a lot of work. So, if you do 1 replanning, the good idea is to do that early. If you do 2 replanning, you will decrease the dose in the parotid gland. The best combination is at week 1 and 2. If you do 3 replanning, you improve your results. And here is 4 replanning, and the best combination is at week 1, 2, 5, and 6. I don't know if you understand these results as well. And 5 replanning is there, and 6 replanning is there. This is really trying to quantify the benefit of several combinations of replanning during treatment, and trying to choose the best approach. Another, I hope I'm not too long. Another way to consider adaptive radiation is in cervix with planning library. The idea is the most standard approach is to consider 3 planning before treatment. 1 with an empty bladder, 1 with a full bladder, and 1 with an intermediate volume bladder. Then at the time of the fraction, you do your CBCT, and you choose the appropriate PTV based on the anatomy of the day. This is a good way to do that. And actually, we have this trial, which is ongoing, and which will be almost ended, which do that, trying to test the benefit of a planning library based on 3 CT scans, and also a replanning, because what happens for cervix, of course, is a uterus motion as well as a tumor shrinking. And you will not correct the tumor shrinking by the pre-treatment planning library. You have to combine both a pre-planning library and a replanning, in theory. However, what was found also is that you have some patients, actually, who have a fixed uterus due to the tumor, whatever is the bladder filling. So your planning library, your pre-treatment planning library will not work. So in this study, published in Medical Physics recently, what we have shown is that we add this planning library based on 3 anatomy, 3 bladder filling, but also based on what we have observed during treatment. The idea was to implement our pre-treatment library with anatomy, significant different anatomy. By doing that, it was possible to show that half of the patients needed to have at least 1 per treatment anatomy implemented in the pre-treatment library to optimize the target coverage. I don't know if I'm clear or not. And as endpoint for this study, we didn't consider those, because when you do a lot of simulation, it's very hard to generate a dose. So as an endpoint, we consider a geometrical endpoint, which is the coverage, the online CTV coverage by the PTV, or the overlapping between the PTV and the organatrice. And with the standard approach, you can see that due to the standard approach, which means only one planning, the upper part of the uterus is quite not well geometrically covered by your PTV. But by doing this standard approach was, the use of a standard library. But by implementing your standard library with online anatomy, you are able to better cover your target. And another way also, we just published also, that's quite different, and maybe I will ask Oscar for your help, which was to use a population analysis, which means that based on a lot of observation of anatomical variation, we were able to modelize the anatomical variation, and just based on one single anatomy, we were able to generate a library of planning based on three different anatomy. I don't know how to explain that. Yeah, this is based on this approach, we were able, finally, based on only one CT scan, to generate the uterus motion. You want to comment that, Oscar? I don't know if I'm very clear. It's in a quite complex approach, based on a population approach, analyzing all the anatomy, and being able to, for a given patient, to look at the anatomical variation. We were able to, again, for a given patient, to predict the uterus position and to generate this anatomy. Because again, the problem of the pre-treatment library is if the uterus is fixed, you are not able to generate the uterus motion. And because the uterus can move during treatment just because of tumor shrinking. So by this approach, it was possible to really So the last one of the last point is another field, which is completely another field, which is also related to indirectly to adaptive radiation and also to this new MRI LINAC machine, is the possibility really to generate an planning based on MRI only. So the idea of the study, just published also in the Red Journal, is to have as input the MRI image, to use several methods, actually we compare, and being able to generate pseudo-CT and therefore dose distribution. And in this work we compare the 5 methods to generate pseudo-CT from MRI. The simplest one is just the bulk density method. Another one was an atlas-based method. Two methods were, other method was based on deep learning, and another original method was based on a patch-based approach. And by doing that, actually for a series of 40 patients, we had the MRI of the patients, the reference CT with the reference dose distribution, and we were able to generate this pseudo-CT by using these methods, and then to compare, to consider 2 endpoints, the image endpoint, the Hounsfield unit endpoint between the reference CT and the pseudo-CT, and the dosimetric endpoint. I just give you the results only for the dosimetric endpoint. Actually, what was interesting is that, and also good news, is that the difference between the methods in terms of dose distribution are very small, almost insignificant. By looking at all these 5 methods, the DVH, including the reference DVH, they are almost the same, usually. It's true that when you are looking very, very carefully, by subtracting the DVH of each method to the reference DVH, there are differences in the accuracy of the method. The most accurate method is really the patch-based method, and in the study, the less accurate was the atlas-based and the bulk density method, which are here, the DVH for the prostate, the bladder, the femoral head. But anyway, what must, as a clinician, what must be considered is that the differences are very small. At the same time, the time calculation, depending on the method, may be very different. For the time calculation for the deep learning is less than 20 seconds. So very, very interesting, very clinically useful. This is something else we have done with Oscar. The last part is what you are doing and with Eugenia and our collaborative work. I will go quickly. The idea is trying to, and this is very interesting also as a physician. You know, when we do our planning, we consider, of course, organ at risk, and we try to limit the dose in the whole organ at risk, which is a good way, of course, to think. But intuitively, it's likely that a subpart of the organ at risk may be particularly sensitive, depending on the symptom you consider. So the goal of this kind of study was trying to really to identify subpart of the organ at risk which are highly sensitive. So there are 2 ways to do that. The first way, we can spell a forward approach. Just if you consider let's say the rectum, dividing the rectum in subparts, or the voxel-wise, those voxel analysis. So if you consider the rectum, you can test. You can cut the rectum in different geometrical parts, and then look at the DVH in this subpart, and look at the predicted values of the DVH. This is possible, but quite not very efficient. The most interesting approach is the inverse dose voxel analysis. So the idea is to consider you have the first step of the voxel-wise analysis, at least what we have done, is you have a series of patients, is to define a template, which is not so easy, and then to propagate the dose into the template. The same story than for the dose monitoring. So the idea to do that is really to propagate the dose from the patient to the template. It should move, but it doesn't move too much. It should be a video, but you know. And then again to consider the patient without toxicity, the patient with toxicity, and to analyze each voxel and to identify the voxel in which the difference is significant between the dose of the patient with or without toxicity, and therefore being able to identify a subpart, in this case of the rectum, which is particularly related to toxicity. And this is something we have done also. If you consider the whole rectum, you compare the DVH of the whole rectum between toxic and non-toxic patients, there was no significant difference. But if you consider this subpart, the DVH were highly significantly different. Another issue behind that is it's a good results. Good news to have identified such subregion to be able to predict the risk of toxicity. But behind that, there is the issue: are you really able to spare this subvolume to decrease toxicity? And this is also current work trying to really check that it's possible not only to predict toxicity, but maybe to decrease toxicity by sparing this subvolume area. If you consider that this subvolume is not only a marker of toxicity, but really related to toxicity, which is Again, this is what we discussed several times. It's not because you have a relationship between two parameters that this is a causality relationship. And for the bladder, for urinary toxicity, for a long time, what was considered is only the dose delivered to the bladder, and trying to correlate the dose to the bladder with toxicity. And all the literature show that the results are not very, the correlation is not very good. So we tried to, and the good science was also to consider that the toxicity is not, of urinary toxicity is not only related to the bladder, but also to the urethra. And we actually, Oscar developed an algorithm being able to, based on only on the CT, to generate the urethra automatically, and with an uncertainty of something like 2 to 3 millimeter in the upper part of the urethra, and less in the inferior part of the urethra. And by doing that, it doesn't work. This should be also video. Sorry. Eugene just showed that the several urinary symptoms may be related to the dose delivered not only in the full bladder, but particularly in the trigonal area, in the posterior part of the bladder. So the conclusion of that is that it's a good idea to spare, of course, the whole bladder when we treat whatever prostate or uterus, but particularly maybe this posterior part of the bladder. So in conclusion, for modern approach of radiotherapy, we do not have to consider only the dose distribution in the paper, not only the accuracy of tumor and organoid elimination, but really what happens during treatment, taking into account this anatomical deformation. For target displacement, image-guided is, of course, the simplest approach. When you have a deformation, the best way is really to go into adaptive strategy, maybe based on the dose-guided approach, and using also being able also to calculate the dose on MRI, and which will be the next future by using such MRI LINAC machine, and also considering some part of the organoid and not only the whole organoid, and therefore being able truly to do dose painting with dose escalation and improving local control and really decreasing toxicity. Behind that, there are still several, behind all these complex technical approaches, there are several issues we need not only to show in the paper and theory that there is a dosimetric benefit, but there is really a clinical benefit, maybe based on phase 3 trial. Consider also that the more you increase the complexity, maybe the more you increase the risk of a lot of things, and the quality control and so on, and also the cost, of course, because of all that. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was clear, and this is just to share one of our landscape in the area we live in France, and here in this part which is Brittany, close to Normandy. Maybe you know this part. And this is the kind of landscape we have, not too bad. Much colder than here. And yes, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, I realise people probably have to get back to work, so we'll just hold off for questions. I'm sure Renaud could hang around if people have particular questions. But just once again, thank you very much, Renaud, for that presentation and for making the expedition onto the other side of the world to give it to us. Please join me in thanking Renaud once again.